Hello everyone. So I actually prepared a 45-minute talk. So since I now know that it's 30 minutes somehow, so that got mixed up. I'm going to, in some areas, just try to kind of go over like what the high level details is. So please, if you have questions about specific things, just hold them. So at the very end, we can talk about it. Thank you, Tammy, for inviting me to this. I'm especially excited to see you all and talk to you guys. I'll just share my screen. So can everyone see my screen okay?
Yep.
Okay. All right, so my name is Judith Odili Uchidiuno. Today I'll be talking to you about designing early literacy and STEM educational interventions for underserved populations. Just a little bit of kind of like my background. My bachelor's in computer science. I have a master's in information systems management. And then this is actually my second career around as this academic life. I used to be a project manager for a bank for a couple of years. And then I went ahead, got a PhD in human computer interaction. And now I'm a postdoc in HCI and robotics education at Carnegie Mellon. And this is from 2020 up till now. So what I do is I design culturally informed early literacy and STEM education technologies to supplement formal education for underserved students. And notice I highlight these three things because they form at the core of my research. Most of my interventions are culturally informed. I supplement formal education and I target underserved students. Most of my work kind of goes across all three of these like foundations, but you have some that kind of focus more on one area than the other. So this talk is kind of organized according to those three areas. Also, my work prioritizes identity development, belonging, enjoyment, and long-term sustainability of interventions. So I have like a lot of like community partnerships and I try to work with them long-term so that way we can really measure growth with students. So far as being culturally responsive, just to kind of begin the talk, I think about it just with this kind of quote from Lansing Billings, who is like famous for pioneering culturally responsive teaching. It's a pedagogy that empowers students intellectually, socially, emotionally, and politically by using cultural reference to impart knowledge, skills, and attitudes. So it's kind of like, how do I center your entire being in the way that I teach you? And when people think about like culturally responsive teaching, they usually think about technology that translates language. This is research that shows that students who learn with intelligent agents that share their accents and their dialects, they have significantly better learning gains than students that don't. There's also things with symbols and icons. So for example, people will see this and different cultures interpret icons differently. So this study, they showed people in the US this icon and they saw things like talking, friends, and conversation. They showed people in Japan this exact same thing and they really focus on the black circle at the back, which is about like lying and double dealing. So even things with iconography is important to kind of understand how different cultures interpret messages. Localized content is also important. People talk about this a lot. For example, imagine if I go to, I'm originally from Nigeria, so I'll say, imagine if I go to a school in Nigeria and I ask how many glasses of lemonade was sold. Just can you estimate how many glasses of lemonade would be sold in the winter versus the summer, right? There's a couple of problems with that question. First of all, I don't remember drinking lemonade a lot when I was growing up. So do kids know what lemonade is? Number two, kids don't have just the mental model of like, I mean, they might know, okay, maybe winter is cold, but still, what is lemonade? Like now I know it's this really icy thing that kids sell outside in the summer, but without the context, you don't really, it's hard to answer a lot of this question. So you can imagine how, if you have some of these things in like math textbooks that can be really detrimental to students. It's also not about like iconography and language and context. It's also things about attitudes, right? So students, in this study, they found that Native American students like spoke shorter utterances and interrupted more. And not because they were trying to be more disruptive, it's just kind of culturally acceptable for them to do so. And so without understanding this, you can punish students unjustly. And so when you think about culture, right, there's been a lot of work in rural African settings so far as the push of education, technology-driven education solutions to try to help with just mediating kind of like education because so a lot of students have poor access to schools and teachers. And so with this push for education solutions, many people have kind of jumped into this. Like this is one laptop per child. This is some work by one of my colleagues who does work with feature phones. And this is my research. So a lot of people have jumped into this space. And generally, there's a high focus on learning gains, which is very important, right? But however, in out of school contexts, students' engagement with education technologies is crucial. So this first study that I'm going to share with you all is really about how do we learn about what keeps students engaged in this cultural context. And by this one, a specific, we're talking about, I was working in Tanzania in a rural village at this point. We know that a classroom is an organized system of social interactions with institutional and social cultural norms, influencing students and teachers' behavior. And so the angle we took with this was how do we can observe a classroom and what do we see about the social cultural norms in here that keep students engaged, and can we transfer this knowledge into the design of education technologies? As I said, this research context happened in a village in northwest, in the northeast of, I just lost my sense of direction, right? In the northwest of Tanzania, and the predominant language is Swahili, feature phones being predominant occupation is farming. And for all our work, we could obtain consent from the village council, from the school officials, and from parents. So for this first study, we're trying to investigate the pedagogical techniques, for example, songs and syllable-based reading that seem engages to students in the classroom. Do they also engage students in tablet-based instruction? And so we observed students in one village, 2 schools in one village over a 2-week period, and this is K through 1. So you think nursery through primary 1 students. We observed that, and then we incorporated the insights that we learned into an education technology design. We deployed those technologies to 283 students spread across 4 villages, kind of as a way to almost substitute education, because these students didn't have access to a lot of like traditional education. And the students were given a pre and a post test to kind of see how much they grew. So we found that for all the domain areas, as far as like numbers, lowercase letters and uppercase letters, the students who learned things with nursery rhymes, like their culturally relevant nursery rhymes annotated with real-world photographs, were significantly more engaged than content areas, the songs that were just annotated with text. It was just almost a thing that captured their attention more than just kind of songs which just had text. And just even thinking about the unit of reading. So I grew up obviously in Nigeria, so British education system, and even in the US, the unit of reading is a letter, right? And so when we were here, was trying to like pre-test students and ask them to write down their letters. And most students, even up to primary 3, couldn't do this. And this made no sense, because I'm like, I've seen this child read before. There's no way that you can't write your letters. And so we were like, okay, I will sing the letter song to you rather than telling you to write it and then write it. And you can see students are writing things in context, writing their letters in context of the syllable rather than just the letter, right? And so I'm just looking at their classrooms. This is in-class teaching materials. Everything is kind of very syllable-based rather than very letter-based. And so we decided to teach them reading using this technology of ours, using the syllable. And we found that students were significantly more engaged with syllables. So 74% completion rates versus 51% when you teach with letters. So these are some examples of how, like, when you understand what is happening in the culture, you can kind of teach students in ways that things in ways that they'll be more engaged with. Okay, so with culturally responsive pedagogy, I also look at it as my target demographic, they're experts in ways to keep themselves engaged. Whenever I walk into a space, I assume that you are the expert in how you learn, and I am in that space to learn, so that way I can kind of design technologies for you. And that means that a primary method of my creating artifacts is through participatory design, co-design. I do a lot of co-design work. It also means that it also doesn't mean that sometimes people don't have the metacognition to communicate how they best learn. For example, children, right? So that's why you have this kind of partnership going, because it's like, I can use my expertise to help elicit the information that you need to communicate to me about the best ways to teach you. And so an example of work that I do with co-design and how culture kind of like is fundamental to the way that we design artifacts is this work is designing co-robotic programming games with primary, like nursery through primary 5 students. And the goal was to increase computational thinking and coding skills among low-income and marginalized students in the US. Altogether, I had 6 research sites with over 100 students, with 1 of them being virtual and 5 of them being in person. And in this program, we're teaching like game design, some fundamentals of programming, playing a lot of games to learn about students like gaming preferences, gaming habits, and just a lot of activities to foster imaginative discourse around game narratives and mechanics as a way to help design the game. This altogether is a 20-week program as its core, with game design taking the first third, programming instruction, and then game testing and iteration. And each session is 1 hour with like snack time, a question of the day, a session of the day, and then freestyle gameplay from a curated list. And we do this for 20 weeks. And after that, we just kind of go back like once a month with the groups to test games that other students have created, because with all these different sites, right, they're all creating different games that is really like showcasing their cultural preferences in play and gaming. One example, this is with a group that is a middle-class mixed race group of students. And this game, so these students, they wanted a shooter, but they're not allowed to shoot shooting games in their homes. And so as a result, they're like, okay, can we, and this was created around Halloween, can we create a Halloween themed like monster battle slime, right? Where we're protecting our candy, right? And this is a kind of game that was interesting to them. I have another group of kids who live in a rural county, predominantly white. And you can see that these kids are not used to having nearly as much structure as their kids and their counterparts who live in the city. And so the kids are like, I don't want a game that has any rules, right? I just want like a playground. I want a farm. I want people to have collectibles. I want to have sports in that game. I want to have a shipping port. I also want a racetrack. And it's multiplayer so they can play with each other. And you can see even some kind of like funny things. Like, for example, someone has a magic carpet in a football field, right? And as these kids play these games, they get to design the games, the mini games that they want to play within this world. And what they really want is a playground. And we do programming, for example, we center kids, obviously, reading ability as we design this game. So you can see there's a lot of like visual iconography in the way that we are designing our programming interfaces. And this is scratch based to help students with comprehension. Finally, this is a game where the students also wanted to play a shooter, but they also wanted to protect their city, right? Because they took a lot of pride in keeping their city clean. They also liked making sure they had nice hair. They could dance was important to this group of students. They also wanted to buy stuff. And so we designed this game that they could go out into the world, capture like toxibots, we'll call them, but they're kind of like rogue robots in the world. They could capture them and then go and convert them for cash that they can spend in this drip shop and all the fancy things that they want. So these are just really some examples of how like culture, if you incorporate culture into the design of your interventions, that doesn't only lead to better learning gains, but also better enjoyment and engagement with the kinds of artifacts that you create. So do cultural differences matter? I hope you think yes, and other researchers agree. So without thinking about cultural differences in pedagogy can lead to boredom and a lack of motivation, harm students' ability to comprehend material, loss of experienced staff, failure of imported curricula, and cultural modeling. So when you teach students in ways that are culturally modeled, some studies have found that students gain more than twice over traditionally taught students. So this is just emphasizing that this is important also for learning. And now this next part, I'll be talking about supplemental formal education. So I design education technologies or learning systems that supplement formal education. And if you just look at statistics, low-income countries and countries in sub-Saharan Africa have the lowest percentage of students who pass a minimum proficiency in math and reading. And this is just not a low-income country problem. This is in my city in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This chart shows the percentage of economically disadvantaged students. So as you go more towards 100%, those are the schools that have the highest percentages of economically disadvantaged students. And you can see the vast majority of them are scoring below state average on the state tests. So it's almost a guarantee that if you're from a poor school, you score less. There's also there's a high level of correlation with that. And sometimes we see the statistics and sometimes it doesn't hit home. This is not me. This is not my actual student. This is an internet picture, but it's kind of representative of the points. I was out gathering data, and this little girl, we'll call her Jaden, she walked up to me and she said, Miss Judith, can you tell me how to, because she just got her report card and she got an F. She sees an F, she knows what an F, she knows an F, it's bad. And so she's like, I see an F here. How do I explain to my mother that I have an F? So I sat with her. I'm like, well, do you know why you got an F in social studies? And she looked at me like, I'm taking social studies. First of all, this girl couldn't read her report. So she didn't know what she got an F in. She also didn't know she was taking social studies, even though she had been in that class all the time. And so these are the kind of levels of kind of interventions that are needed, right? Like before you even get the kids to a place where they're taking a subject, right? There's things just like basic reading competency and just awareness of what they're doing, that in a way that you just have to, it says, how do we get this student to a place where they don't even have an F anymore, given how much they have to catch up on? So thankfully, a lot of organizations are worried about this problem. The Global Learning X Prize in 2018 was one of these organizations that was saying, you know what, okay, can we see if education technologies can supplement formal education and sometimes even replace formal education if there's no schools available. My team was one of the finalists for this, this initiative. And we have evidence that if you design things and deploy it properly, you can actually see some learning gains. So at the beginning of our study, this is with over 2,000 students, students with pre-testing showing with root vowel repetition, and they had some exposure to vowels and their sounds. And that's where most students started. At the end of 6 months, a lot of students were independently reading 3-letter syllables. They had mastered all 24 letters, and most two-letter syllables. And this is just an average usage of 6 session days per month, right? So that's not a lot for someone who has no schooling, and yet we were able to see some positive learning gains. Also in writing, at the beginning, students were tracing vowels. At the end, they were copying 2-letter syllables and not just tracing them, like copying them. They had mastered copying, tracing, and independently writing all their letters and numbers. This is also with an average usage session of average usage of 6 session days per month. Naila Nasir is one of my favorite researchers, scientists on the importance of learning in ways that are culturally responsive. But there's this quote from one of her textbooks or one of her book chapters that says, learning happens in a wide range of activities outside school, including like dairy work, plumbing, hairdressing, basketball, etc. People can competently perform complex cognitive tasks outside of school, but may not display these skills on school-type tasks. So this indicates the importance of understanding the nature of learning in and out of school settings. And a lot of my work kind of like is, you know, leans into this thing, like we can supplement formal education by taking advantage of the kinds of connections that students have outside of school to cement their knowledge. This work, it kind of is an example of that. And I was doing work co-designing a mobile application to support scientific inquiry, to foster scientific inquiry among children and their families at home. So in the background here, you see something we call bags of stuff, which is just a thing that has lots of things like pom-poms and pipe cleaners to help students make things. So we're designing a social media application here and also like a community display. So community members, families could see what students were working on. So as usual, we do lots of interviews and focus groups and co-design sessions, but we're also doing things like artifact galleries. So a lot of families display the things that are important to them. So that way we could incorporate these things into how we're designing the technologies. And also an interview watch party. So we would interview parents and have this about their interactions with their children. and have the children watch and critique it and vice versa. And we found that this kind of fostered a lot of like family conversations in a way that led to very positive outputs in the way that we co-designed the technology. This is just an example of families just like putting up display and negotiating how they want the community displays to look like. Yeah. This is one student, Emma, in her social media application, just kind of putting snippets of the kinds of things that this can elicit. So she made pizza at home and she said, I made pizza, and you can see like there's fist bumps and comments, and this can be comments from other students as well. And here she's wondering about how can it be so warm for a few days and then snow, right? And there's some fist bumps and you see some student conversation going on. So here she says, some people are allergic to gluten, right? What exactly is gluten? And you can see how they're making these connections when they're home settings to school in a way that a teacher can pick this up and help students to kind of to connect the science they're learning in school to what is happening at home. This is an example of the community display, and this was not only put in the centers that were working, but also in their schools and in the libraries as well for community members to see what their students were working on. We wrote a bunch of papers on these. Feel free, if you want to learn more about this work, I can send you references as well. Finally, with the last amount, the remaining time that I have, which is, I think, by my clock, about 10 minutes, I'm going to be talking about designing for underserved students. And a lot of my work in the past, or in this talk, has talked about underserved students, but this is really about the timeliness of the intervention. There are things that people need at this time that we just have to design for in a way that kind of goes above designing for just low-income struggling populations in general. So this work is really going to be focusing on the need for designing for teachers and knowledgeable adults and how we can help students support one another in learning situations. So in Tanzania specifically, access to education is considered a basic human right. And as a result of all the work that the government has been doing, secondary school enrollment has increased by over 50% up to 2012. However, at the same time, the number of teachers in the system actually decreased by 10%. The number of students, schools only increased by 2.4%. And the teacher to student ratios are very high. So you have 1 to 82, 1 to 98. As a matter of fact, in my last study, I had a school where there was one teacher who was responsible for the whole school. That was 310 students. And that teacher was principal, and he was teacher for all the subjects for all the students. So these are the kinds of settings that we're talking about. It's just difficult to recruit teachers to rural areas. I mean, there's just research that shows that when people have shown up to schools and just teachers are just not there because basic things are hard. Going for medical, just for healthcare is 2 days out. Going to a bank to get money is a day's journey, right? So things are just harder in rural areas. And so this is just, we conducted a series of studies because our goal was to design technology to help students support one another, right? Since we can guarantee the presence of knowledgeable adults. And so the first thing we did was, how do we see how students use technology by themselves when you just give it to them? The second study is how can peers support one another? And the third study was how can technology scaffold this help-seeking process? So I'm going to skip over this. The point of this was it's important both adults and peers support one another in ways that are that improve cognitive activity, provide motivation and support, enforcing rules of engagement. For this first study is what happens when you deploy education technology in rural settings. And as I said, all our work is in this rural context in Tanzania, where altogether we worked in 4 schools. The predominant occupation is farming, and we have consent from the council, school officials, parents. For this first study, we wanted to know the kinds of support the students needed to effectively learn with education technologies. And we observed 50 students in nursery through primary 2 at home, with the parents being mostly farmers, shop owners, and some teachers as well. We found that students needed a lot of application support. So how do I just navigate an application? Of the 30 sessions we ran, we found this in 26 sessions. We found that students obviously needed knowledge like content support, which is what you would expect, right? Students just need help knowing the math content, the reading content. And finally, digital literacy. We only found of the 50 students, only 2 of them were able to just do a tap gesture correctly without help. So this is kind of the level of digital literacy we're talking about. So we can see things where students are trying to like tap the tablets with their lips, you know, with their fists. And you see like adults, like teachers helping to model correct behavior. So we talked about the main kinds of supports. Peers were providing this thing by modeling and direct manipulation. So I will show it to you, I'll do it for you without any conversation. But unfortunately, the help was inconsistent and sometimes unwanted. We found more focus in school than at home. And adults are able to provide this kind of all 3 kinds of supports because they're teachers, no surprise. So given teachers limited presence and capacity, right? How do we design technologies that allow peers to support one another? In this case, we did a study where we created groups of students to provide support from one another in different experimental conditions. We told them either, in one case, we told everyone who the group leader was. So this one student is a leader, everyone talk to them if you need help. And in the other case, we only pulled one student from each group and told them, you are the leader of the group. Support students, if you see anyone struggling for help, help them. And we found, so we wanted to know how are they able to take on the role of a leader, either privately or publicly assigned, and what kinds of support do they give? And so these are just like short videos that show the kinds of interactions that students, baseline interactions that students would have without a leader in the room. So there's knowledge telling where I'm just kind of showing you the answer without really explaining to you. There's a lot of imposition where I don't really want you in my space, but you're reaching in and you're bothering me. There's a lot of interruption where I don't like what you're doing, so I'm going to interrupt what you do, interrupt your work. There is some feedback sharing where this student was about to tap the wrong answer and this student just like smacked their hand away. And also there's active help seeking where students need help and they're reaching out to their peers to support them. And so in this case, we found that in the private leader condition, and there's a video here that I want you guys to see, the leaders only responded to about 21% of help requests. And there were clear negative consequences for when a student needed help and didn't get it. For example, lots of inactivity, walking away, some tears. And the help was not persistent at all. So in this case, this girl in the pink shirt needs help. She taps the boy beside her and he doesn't help her much. The leader of the group was actually this girl in the burgundy sweater with the Nyati tablet. So she tries to help for a while, but that doesn't help the girl who needs the help. And so she reaches out again for help. And you can see the leader just like smacks her hand away. And this is a private leader condition because there's just no social pressure for her to provide the help. But in this case, when we had the public leader condition, they responded to about 75% of the help requests. They generally did not impose because a lot of students were calling on them for help. And they showed a lot of persistence in help given. So in this case, this girl needed help, called out to the group leader, and he goes to her. And this was actually a technical problem where he needed to restart the device. And he just stays beside her and just tries his hardest to figure it out. Even when he can't figure it out, he stays there for much longer, just to show how persistent the help can be. So we can't rely on students to naturally emerge. It's a social expectation of helping that elicits better helping behavior. And the help should be designed to be more equitable to avoid the burden on one student. Finally, I'm going to glance over this. So this is kind of like us building technologies to support this help-seeking process, since teachers are such a scarce thing in this place. We designed an Android-based system that would detect errors related to these kinds of issues that I talked about, application and domain knowledge. And the system will provide feedback when necessary, including the recommendation that they seek help from their peers who overcome that problem. So here, a student would be engaged in a task. If they're struggling after a while, and this is just based on historical data, we know how long it takes for students to complete things. We would have this hand raising icon on the top right. And it will suggest a student in the room that you can go and call upon to help you and say it out loud. So that way there's some kind of social expectation of who the helper is. And we found altogether, this was kind of a between subject study with 100 students across 5 grades. We had pre and post tests to determine learning gains, random assignments balanced by students' prior relationships to one another to form each group. To form each group, we had this, I will go over this, the point of this slide is we use a sociometric technique just to make sure that each group had a similar level of cohesion related to their friendships before, as we created each group, each learning group, either in the experimental or in the control condition. It's a little bit of how we formed the groups. We pulled students from their classrooms for the experiment. Students sat in a long row adjacent to one another. And with every session, we randomized the sitting positions. Altogether, there were 8 groups in the experimental and another 8 groups in the control condition. So this altogether, this was about 137 hours of data that we collected, a lot of qualitative data analysis to annotate, and something called the 30-second partial coded interval too as well to annotate the data. On the quant side, with the system logs, we know the kinds of help that students were struggling with based on the kind of errors that we detected. And we did a lot of like hierarchical linear modeling and ordinary least squares and regressions to understand the places that how the help was occurring. We wanted to just see, does this technology increase interactions with non-adjacent peers? And does it increase student selection of harder activities? Altogether, we found that overall, just the orange bar here is a control, is the experimental condition. And we found that significantly students where the number of non-adjacent interactions was significantly increased with the use of the learning intervention. And at first, students do this a lot because they don't quite know how to tell what they should help with and what they can't. Over time, it reduces, but still, students just get better at monitoring their cognition over time. We found that prior friendships didn't really matter. Students worked quite well with their friends, even in this setting or across gender, because there was a social expectation of help given. We also found that there was a lot of application support, knowledge sharing, information sharing, technical supports. But we also saw in the intervention, there's knowledge supports, which we hadn't seen in the control in our previous studies. And it's something that research studies show that is extremely difficult to get out of students. The students were able to recognize the icons as equivalent to the hand raising they had in their classrooms, which was fantastic because we're hoping the icons will transfer. We saw some knowledge telling, but also some knowledge building where students would say, this is bay, tap bay. This is cool, tap cool. And also some explanations that we were able to elicit using this technology as well. Finally, there's a lot of positive help interactions. So at first, the blue bar just shows the number of help dismissals. And you can see as students are getting more advanced with the sessions, students are providing more positive help interactions because it's just getting better at monitoring their cognition over time. So here, this is just across all the grades. This is a short video. And this is probably the last thing I'm going to share with you all. You can see across all the grades, this is like nursery 2, students request for help. And you can see the helper goes over, provides it, does something that's not really useful. And you can see the student is complaining when they don't get the help that they need. And then he tries to reactivate the helper to get somebody else to come and help them. In primary 1, in this case, the student originally dismissed the help, but the students insisted for the help. And the student was able to go back in there and provide the kind of thing they needed. In this case, and we're looking at the students all the way to the right here, they're suggesting for help, and it gives them a helper that can help them, but they don't want that helper. They want somebody else. And so they go back and they request for help again because they know the kind of problem that they have and they know the person who they want to help them. And finally, in this one, this is in primary 3, the helper goes over to help and is going away, but you can see that the students will insist when the help is not enough. All right, so I'm going to skip over this part. The point of this is like students with our technology were able to pick things that were harder because they knew that help was available to support them. Okay, that's the end of this study. We wrote a bunch of papers on our work in Tanzania. If you are interested in like know more about this work, please reach out to me and I'll kind of send out reference papers as well. So right now I am doing a lot of work in developing teacher supports, STEM and early literacy technology solutions for use in low resource settings, especially like in rural villages in Tanzania and Ivory Coast right now. I am working on early literacy and computational thinking curriculums in after-school settings in the US, and investigating the use of role-playing games to connect students' interest in arts and athletics to STEM careers. All right, thank you. That's my talk.